I am Amy Vetter, and welcome to the Breaking Beliefs podcast. This valuable time is for you to pause in your day and go on your own self-journey. Discover the beliefs that are holding you back from living your best life at work and at home. Learn from the guests on this show as they share their inspirational stories on how they found ways to break internal beliefs that were no longer serving them. Because if you believe you can, you will. And our podcast begins now. Welcome to this episode of Breaking Beliefs, where I interviewed Janine McClintock, the CEO of J9 Leading Solutions. As CEO, she is a leadership development consulting firm and has worked with thousands of leaders to accelerate their leadership readiness. She trains and coaches managers and executives on leadership issues in the workplace. She is the author of Stir It Up, Stay Relevant, and creator of the Step Up and Lead digital program to fill a glaring gap for employees that want to develop leadership skills and stay relevant but do not have access to formal training and coaching. She travels and speaks internationally and does in-person training and virtual workshops on leadership topics, including change management, emotional intelligence, team effectiveness, employee engagement, and mental wellness to large audiences and small groups. Her academic credentials include a BA in economics and communication from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a master's in organizational leadership from Chapman University. During this episode, we talked about Janine's journey from working in her father's business as well as her grandfather's bakery to establishing her own consulting practice. We highlighted key experiences that shaped her entrepreneurial path and her approach to work-life balance. We discuss her approach to maintaining these boundaries while pursuing her professional goals based on what she learned from her entrepreneur family. I hope you enjoy this podcast. And if it's something that you want to share with someone, please go ahead, share it, like it, subscribe, so that others can learn from these lessons from Janine. Welcome to this episode of Breaking Beliefs. I'm very excited to interview Janine today. And Janine, before we get started, would you just give the audience a little background on yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I am a California native, and I am a lifelong learner. And my current profession, which we'll get more into, is I serve as a business coach, keynote speaker, and I'm an author of a recent book. I grew up in a small town and found books and education as my channel to new things, and kind of retain that as a high value in my core value in my life. I am happily remarried to John, and I have two stepsons, Jack and Finn, and a son, Connor. So we have three grown adult men all out in the world. So it gives me great time to pursue my business and my interests and be on a podcast like yours.
Awesome. Yeah, I used to say boy mom, but I'm a man mom now too. So
It's a really hard transition. I had to really, in my head, I have to think about that because I want to say the boys, but they don't want me to say that anymore.
Exactly. So why don't we start there? Where did you grow up? What did your parents do? What was the town you grew up in?
Yeah. So I'm from Petaluma, California, and I grew up in an entrepreneurial family. My grandfather in the 50s started a bakery and made sourdough French bread. So we're up in that area where it makes the good bread. And so that was Lombardi's French bakery. And so my grandfather started it, and then my dad at a young age, after high school, stepped fully into the business and ran the business. And so my, experience growing up was my mom was the bookkeeper. My sister and I worked behind the little retail counter, selling cookies and donuts and things like that. And everybody was involved in the business. And so that was very much set in me a lot of my belief systems around work and work ethic. And my dad employed about 40 people. And so this idea of what it means to be the source of other people's income and their livelihood and their life, and how you have to, as a business owner, and a leader, protect that. The most probably significant thing beyond that entrepreneurial piece is that I'm from a very large Italian family. So the last name was Lombardi, my maiden name. And so I grew up with lots of aunts and uncles and cousins around and Sunday dinners. And I didn't know anything other than always having a lot of family around and celebrating every event, baptisms, birthdays, all those sorts of things. So very formative to my growing up years, being surrounded by my family. Everybody lived in the same town.
And how many brothers and sisters did you have?
So just one sister, a younger sister, Donna. And, growing up, we were just a few years apart, but, it wasn't really till we were older that we formed what I now see as this very sacred sister bond. Growing up, there was a little bit of we were always fighting and things like that. But now we, as adults, we are very close and partly bonded too we had our kids 6 months apart. So we became new moms together and kind of going through that experience together, I think really shifted things in our relationship too. But yeah, just one sister.
So when you were little working in the bakery, did you think that was going to be your future to be running this, or did you have other dreams?
I had other dreams because I think working in there was, when you're back by the oven that's cranking out the bread, it's super hot. I made garlic bread. I smelled like garlic. For me, as a young woman, I was like, yeah, I don't want to do this. No offense to my dad or my family or any of that. But I
Did
think
they want you to?
No, I don't think that was even an expressed, they very much encouraged, I excelled in school and they very much encouraged, going to college and, pursuing whatever my dreams were. And so what my dreams were really at the time were twofold. I was interested in teaching. I thought I might want to be a teacher. I mean, it's so hard when you're a teenager, right? But I loved writing also. And when I ultimately went away to school, to the University of California, Santa Barbara, I wanted to be a journalist. So that's what I ultimately was my plan, which, as we know, by the time I finished my college education and I worked at the Daily Nexus, our daily newspaper, I decided, yeah, that was a pretty brutal lifestyle. And of course, this is well before the internet and all the ways media has changed now. But just the hours were hard for producing a daily newspaper. So I kind of got out of college not wanting to pursue that as a career. And so, like many young people in their young 20s, I was kind of aimless at the time, didn't really know what I wanted to do. And now I look back and think, well, that was perfectly fine and appropriate. It felt pretty uncomfortable at the time. But it also is an example of how sometimes when one door closed, I closed a door on something I thought I wanted. And I just was kind of open to whatever came. And I ended up getting an early job at a company that I stayed at for 18 years. And so I really found a place that was an unknown field to me per se, but it was led by a female CEO. It was kind of a startup mode, about 60 people at the time. And it allowed for a 23-year-old to really take initiative. And that's part of my again, my belief system is I was raised to, I could do whatever I put my mind to doing, whatever I was committed to doing and disciplined to do, I could do. And so I would often, as this new person who didn't really know anything, would raise my hand to say, I could do that. I'll try that. We want to open an office in Northern California. I'll figure out how to lease office space and hire people and grow the office, so it ended up being just a perfect environment for me to grow as a young professional. And then as I matured in my career, it still provided a really great place for me to grow and develop. And that was that was one of those early core values of always improving and getting better and learning. And I had a place to do that at the organization I worked in for so long.
What kind of company was this?
So it was a residential real estate company. We managed properties in Southern California homeowners associations. It was called the Merit Companies at the time, and then it was acquired, and now it's called First Service. So it's part of a larger entity. And I've now been out of that. So I don't want people to do the math, but I've been out of the company as long as I was in it now. And when we went through that acquisition is when I chose to take a leap into entrepreneurship on my own. And so now I've had my own consulting practice for almost 18 years as well. So going back to those roots, like I had the confidence from and growing up in that environment where my dad and grandfather, they were business owners, to do that. I had a good run working for somebody else in a more traditional corporate structure, but was anxious to try something on my own.
Yeah. So, how did you even get involved in that startup in the first place since it wasn't in your
Well, it's like one of those funny stories. One of the, again, random roommates that, like, I answered an ad, you get a roommate, because you can't afford to live on by yourself. And so I was
Mhm.
living in a house with three other girls, and she worked there, and she really seemed to like her job. And she's like, "We're interviewing, we're hiring, you should come interview." I'm like, "Okay." So I did, and, they hired me, and I kinda needed to pay rent, and, so I took the step. I mean, it could have just as easily been something I did for 6 months and moved on, right?
Right.
But, in my early career, people didn't talk about culture, company culture like they do now in organizations. And bottom line is the culture was what did it for me, right? An environment and a culture, and it had leadership that the role modeling that I received there, because they were women, a lot of the leaders were women, and with younger families, I thought, oh, it really is possible to kind of do this and think about that I could have a family and have children and all that sort of thing, which was something I wanted to do at some point in the future, right? I wasn't
Yeah.
in a hurry to do that. In fact, waited, over 10 years to dive into being a mom. Yeah, I was just, again, I think there's a lot of that kind of serendipity and relationships, right? People, I mean, I really built my business on people that I knew to begin with, right? Relationships I already had. And then from there, really, that's how through my reputation grew and my referrals grew and my repeat business has grown, and it's really enabled me. And I think that goes all the way back to my Italian family roots and what it means to be, or, connect with people and be around people, and so yeah.
What was unique about the culture? Like, because you referenced that a lot. So I understand there were female leaders, but what made the culture so unique that it kept you interested? Because someone that is entrepreneurial, by making, for you to stay at a company that long, what was it about that company that did that for you?
Well, so a few things. And I think one of them, though, is directly related, is that it really was an entrepreneurial environment. We were, adding business lines, we were adding regional offices, we were growing. So there was this energy there around the culture of, strategic growth. And so it wasn't a really established old company, right? With
Mhm.
everything in play. It was really growing. I felt like I grew with the organization. So that was one thing about the culture. The other thing was that people, it's very cliche about how important the people are in a business, but I really feel that that was honored there. And again, this is when there were not the kind of flexible policies that there are maybe in more today's environment, but we had very flexible work arrangements. So the work-life balance was a consideration. So the policies were what I would say people friendly, at a
Mhm.
and progressive at a time when those things weren't so common. And I thought, this is really awesome. Including just being supportive of, I went while I worked there back to get my master's degree in organizational leadership, right? And they supported that and they helped pay for that. So, the culture really encouraged you to keep developing the next best version of yourself. And they put their money where their mouth was. They provided, and part of the role that I played ultimately too, later I went from the client side of the business to human resources and learning and development and organizational development, is then I got to help create a lot of those programs for people, emerging leader programs, and ways in which we could help develop people. So the culture really was about developing people from within, promoting from within, which was great. They really showed a lot of care for the people, for the employees, which I thought was important. And, again, as being an employee and then later as a leader, kind of leading in that way. And just that idea of, we we can continue to grow as a business if we take care of people and our and also they were certainly very customer facing and customer focused. But in terms of why I stayed, it was because I felt I was seen as a person, not just as employee, producing revenue for a business, right? I was
Yeah.
much more than that, and encouraged to. And the other piece is significant is the philanthropy piece that was embedded in the culture, where we did a tremendous amount of community service work, and we were, encouraged to, if there was something happening during, maybe traditional work hours, it was okay to go volunteer and do that thing, and support. We supported a number of organizations as a company, but then also people had individual pursuits, and organizations that they wanted to support. That was really encouraged. So that whole volunteer aspect, and we were part of these communities where all these properties were. So we really, you know, were invested in making sure we could contribute in a positive way.
So when you decided to leave, did you already have in your mind to be an entrepreneur, or were you going to look for another job?
I had about a year, right? If you've ever been through a merger, right? There was
Mhm.
a time of the transition, which I stayed to help with, but had decided to exit at that point. It's when I had one of those, I call them like a change quake, where I had a big birthday. My son started kindergarten. My marriage of 20 years fell apart, and my job, where I'd worked for 18 years, was it's no longer going to be as it was, right? And I didn't want to stay. Yeah, so I had a lot of change happening in my life at one time that drove my decision to, and it did feel like a very big leap at the time, because I had, was going from a steady paycheck and 401k and health insurance.
Mhm.
And even the home that I lived in was going to change with the change in my marriage. So I decided, though, that from a lifestyle perspective, if I could be the captain of my own ship, so to speak, that I would have more control, I guess would be one way to put it, about the hours I worked and my ability to walk my son to school or take time to be at his games and things like that. And so I really wanted to try to create the best case scenario for me to be the professional that I wanted to be, as well as the parent that I wanted to be. And now looking back, my son is now out of college, living in Austin, Texas, working, right? So it all worked well. And looking back, I can definitely say it was the right decision. I mean, now if I'd gone to work for another company, would it have been a bad decision? Who knows? I am really glad. And it was, those first few years are challenging when you're
Yeah.
trying to, build things up and get word out and start. But I have a lot of fond memories looking back, even though it was certainly the struggle at times, right, to launch and to get going.
So how did you get started?
Well, I went back to leveraging and my relationships. So there were two distinct things that I did. One was to go back to my alma mater, Chapman University, where I got my master's. And I had served on a board there that when I was on the business side, advising the university what employers wanted their people to have in terms of leadership and management development. And so I knew they offered that out in the community. So this was like beyond the traditional 4-year education kind of courses. So through them, I got involved and received clients through that channel, right? So a company would come and say, "Hey, we want to do some of this leadership development work. Who do you have that you could recommend?" And Chapman would recommend me. And then on the nonprofit side, I also wanted to do some of the leadership development work with nonprofits. And so in our area here in Southern California, we had an organization that focused on supporting nonprofit leaders, and I, again, aligned with them. It was called the Volunteer Center of Orange County. Now it's called 1OC. And so a nonprofit might come and say, "We want to do some board training for our board of directors," or "We might want to do some strategic planning. We need a consultant to help us with that." And again, so I kind of aligned myself with what were known entities. And then I found my clients that way. And then over time, that proof of concept, having those clients, then I could talk to a new prospective client and refer to those clients. So it was a really probably one of the smartest strategic decisions I made was to align and make it easy for me to start doing work. And then eventually became known in the community, and people could come directly to me. So it was a good bridge in that sense. And it gave me a little bit of a community too, because it is challenging being an entrepreneur on your own. I did distinctly choose not to set up like a brick and mortar, hire a bunch of employees. I wanted to really keep it lean, my operation. And if I need to scale up for a project, I'll, bring in other contractors to do that. But it's worked out to be a good business plan for me.
So, what are some of the biggest lessons you think you've learned as an entrepreneur?
One of the things, just from a mindset perspective, where I am today is early on, I really was stuck in proving myself, right? Proving that I was the right person for them to hire, proving I was a good coach, I was in that kind of proving mode, and learned fairly quickly that I don't need to put my energy in that place per se. And the way I think about it is, how am I improving as a professional, right? I moved from that proving mindset to improving. And I just think about, what am I doing today that makes me and my business better than I was yesterday? And that sort of shift in my thinking, I think, was really helpful, because that allowed me to then just really think about getting better, as opposed to, proving I was good enough to get the work or to get the contract or to work with the client. So that was one thing. And then, as I've mentioned, kind of the thread for sure is how significant the relational piece of being an entrepreneur is. And it was not just for business purposes, but for me as a human being, I needed relationships with people that were more than transactional, that were over time, that had ways that I could build from the connection with the person, as a human being as well. So that I have really found that some of those clients that I've worked with over time, have turned into be, friends and people that, I care about what happens in their family and things like that too. And so that those things don't have to be mutually exclusive. And it does help, then I also have kind of a squad of other professionals that do similar work, and we support each other. And when one of us, learns something about a new technology or tool, we'll share with the other. So I learned to build a support system, right? So they, kind of that idea of you might have the board of directors who advises you on growing your business, but also this group of people that really is your village if you're not growing, a team, which again, I didn't do on purpose. Then from an entrepreneurial standpoint too, that there are seasons, and I have been through seasons, right? Of seasons when you're ramping up, seasons when you're growing, seasons when you kind of plateau and you've got to maybe rethink what you're doing. And, like the pandemic that happened, really that caused a shift in my business where I was doing less, obviously, in-person workshops and speaking type engagements, and focused more on the executive coaching. And that is when was able to write my book, was during that kind of period of when my other traditional work got slower. And it was a great space to be able to then shift and write a book, which, as at the beginning, as I was saying, I loved writing, right? And so I didn't pursue my path in journalism, but ultimately I got to write a book, which was really a lot of fun. And I was really grateful for that opportunity.
And what drove you to write that book? What was burning inside of you that you needed to do that?
So I think part of it was I was looking for my next improvement, right? My next area of development. And I felt like, working a lot one-on-one with people was great, but that limits the scale at which you can be supportive of people. And so I thought, if I could take what I do with some of my coaching clients and put that into a book and a guide to help people self-coach themselves, right? Like, so to give them some of the tools if they don't have a coach, whether it's for economic reasons, they can't afford one, or they don't have access or what have you, for, the cost of a book, they could really walk themselves through a coaching model. But the trigger was a Wall Street Journal article in 2020 that said, and this is so here we are, said in 2024 that 70% of the tasks that a manager does could be replaced by AI. It was much more speculative in this article.
Hmm.
And but the trigger for me was, okay, what are these managers they had, even if they had 50% more capacity to do other work, what would they do with that? And always what gets kind of like the one-on-one employee time, the development time, the leading in that way is when all the tasks get in the way, gets short-circuited. So I thought, wow, if that's going to be the case, people are really going to be worried about staying relevant, right? They're going to be worried that they're going to become obsolete and maybe lose their jobs. And of course, this is all what's in the media every day now. And so that's what drove me to write the book, was to help people feel like they could reclaim some of their own agency about what was happening around them, right? And so, like, the tagline of the book is, don't let work happen to you, make it work for you. And the book offers 8 areas to think about and ask yourself coaching questions to help in that regard. And fun part about the book, though, and the story is, and this is where entrepreneurism is really a lot of, it's taking risks, right? But it's a lot of experimentation. So I started to write the book in a traditional business book sort of way, and I just wasn't gelling for me in a way. Like, it felt heavy. And I had really wanted to write a story, like a parable. Like, if you're familiar with that book, Who Moved My Cheese, or Patrick Lencioni's work, right? Like, I wanted to write a story because that was the creative writing part that I wanted to do. So I put aside half of a manuscript that I had already done and wrote a story in which I could teach these same lessons, but in a, which for me was a funner way. And and then it felt joyful and interesting to do. And I wasn't resisting sitting down and putting my, words to paper and that sort of thing. So it was a great lesson of, when you try something, it may not always be the final thing. Like, I could have muscled through to the end of the other manuscript, but
Hmm.
I was glad that I chose to reevaluate and take a different tact, and it turned out to be a much better for me personally experiencing it. And then I think the final book is, it's user friendly for people. The feedback I get is easy to read, it's easy to follow. They enjoy the story. They're not getting hung up on all these, research and, academic sounding kind of stats. And even it is a business case study, but it's involved in a story, right? And so
Hmm.
people can also take what this particular leader did with her team that was trying to integrate AI into their workflow, and they could actually follow some of that facilitation she even does through the story. That's really not the tool I'm giving, but if you know enough to pay attention, you could replicate that as well. So it was fun.
Yeah. What would you say are maybe a couple of the biggest lessons of the book?
Sure. So I think the primary one is that, like, it has to go to the confidence piece, right? Where if people take some of the time to do the inner work of kind of reflecting, asking themselves these questions, being introspective, that they will then learn that they really have what they need already, right? Like, within them,
Mhm.
they can tap into, like, that reservoir of skills that they can repurpose. They can tap into that reservoir of, being a problem solver. They can tap into that reservoir of being solutions oriented, and take some action that's going to move them out of being stuck. I mean, the main thing that I'm trying to help people do is not feel paralyzed or stuck by their circumstance. Again, in this story, happens to be with the incoming AI into the organization, but it could be any change, and people feeling like, I don't know a way out. And the simple act, as a coach, as you probably do as well, we use questions to help people gain insights, rather than, coaching isn't telling people what to do. So similarly, in the book, I want people to come away with the fact that, with asking themselves some questions, and I try to help them not have to think of what the questions are, help provide some of those questions. They can really craft a path forward and create their own roadmap to evolving and staying relevant in whatever field they have, and really kind of owning, right, who they are and where it is that they're going, and not feeling a victim of their circumstance.
Hmm. Yeah. I think many people go through that, especially I think we can all speak from our own experience of, especially in entrepreneurship, of going through all those stages. Is there anything you've taken away from watching your grandfather and your father
Mhm.
as leaders, since you did work for them, and incorporated it into things that you do today?
You know, one of the things, this is going to sound, it's like a mantra. My dad, they've both since passed, but my dad they worked very hard, right? Like
Mhm.
there was a lot of hard work and effort that went into it. But they also enjoyed their family, and my dad would say work hard, play hard, right? And
Mhm.
so I do carry that into, because it can get very easy as an entrepreneur to feel like you're working all the time, right? And I think their example, and sometimes too, maybe they could have done even more of it, but I really try to balance my playtime with my work time as well. And it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. Like I say, I found a way to make writing that book fun for myself. Um,
Mhm.
but really helping me create the boundaries, right, that need to, when you are an entrepreneur, that you need to create space for personal relationships, not just business relationships. You need to create space for, exercise, all the things. And I, again, some of the example that I set, where they maybe didn't do best at that, but the part that they did do was create that boundary between work and kind of family and just playtime. So
And how did they create that boundary? Because it's hard to do in a restaurant type business.
yes, yes. Well, I think part of it, right, was they bringing good people in, right? Like got to a point where my dad they could trust other people to run the business. And then they kind of, it's making it work for what the situation is. So we had like a vacation home, and this is goes all the way back to my grandpa. There was a lake, and growing up, he took my dad and his brothers and sisters to this lake, and there was this whole lake thing that was the separation of the work. And then my dad, same thing. We got a house, or a little place up there, and would go water skiing, and there was a physical like place to go that wasn't in town and wasn't work. And so
Mhm.
um that just kind of set up that, they had to do it like in a physical way. I think
Yeah.
I'm able to do that in a different way, but that that was kind of where those seeds were sowed in terms of understanding that, you need to get away and take breaks. Like I have a trip coming up, leave next Thursday. It's 2 weeks. I'm not bringing a computer. I'm not going on social media. 2 weeks. I'm just absolutely, I'm out of the country. I'm gonna take the break, and I deserve, and it's not anything I need to feel bad about or apologize for, or my business not going to fall apart if I take 2 weeks off. And in fact, I'm pretty good. I take a couple weeks a few times a year now, right? So it's,
Yeah.
as I mature in my business, I can also evolve those boundaries to be even creative and more for myself.
Awesome. Well, been so many good lessons. I like to wrap up just asking some rapid fire questions, and you pick a
Okay.
category:
Okay.
family and friends, money, spiritual, or health.
Health one, because that's an important part of my value system too, is health. So
Okay.
well-being. Yeah.
Things or actions I don't have that I want with my health.
That I don't have that I want. Don't have. I'm trying to think of the right way to say it. So it's not very rapid fire. Like I don't have.
That's okay.
Um, I don't have what I want to say is I have too much sugar, and I don't want
Yeah.
to have that. Right. Right.
Okay.
So I don't have, and it's not self-control, but I do, I would like to have less sugar in my life.
Yes.
So I'm working on that. But that seems to be one of the harder things for me to totally master.
I'm with you. As soon as
Yeah.
that's like offered, it's like hard. Things or actions I do have that I want to keep.
So for me, the big one is movement. I have significant movement every day, and it's just, and it might look different. Monday was stand up paddle boarding. Yesterday was golfing. Today is going to be a walk. Tomorrow I have yoga. Like I move every day in a significant way. And that is important, not just the physical aspect, but for me, it's the mental well-being aspect of movement. So I don't ever want to lose that.
And things or actions that I do have that I don't want to keep.
I do have that I don't want to keep. I guess maybe that's where I was thinking the sugar, right?
Okay.
Yeah. I do have a bit of an aversion to vegetables. So I don't want to have that aversion. So I try really hard to try different recipes and different ways of making the veggies appealing. But sometimes I feel like a 5-year-old who doesn't want to eat their broccoli, but
Yeah,
trying to move
exactly.
towards more plant-based.
Yeah. Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with or we haven't covered that you want to make sure we close out our conversation with?
I think this kind of came up throughout the conversation, but just this idea that change, right? Which everybody, there's a lot of uncertainty right now. There's a lot of change for people that it's not a switch, right? Like it doesn't happen in a moment. It happens over time, and it's really more of a cycle. And learning to kind of recognize where you are in the cycle of change, you might be at the point where something is ending and you're having to let that go, and you're somewhat maybe kind of almost grieving that. Like you have to recognize you're there, or you might be kind of past the ending, but you're in the what I like to call the messy middle, right? Things aren't quite what they're going to be yet either, but they weren't what they were in the past. And then there's that kind of idea of the actual new beginning. And so recognizing where you are in the change kind of cycle helps to ground you in maybe what you could do to help yourself feel better in those different phases, right? Because it is uncomfortable, which is why some people choose to stay kind of stuck where they are because the discomfort, as you and I know from our businesses, the discomfort is where the transformation and the growth happens. But it can be painful and it can be hard. And so I would just encourage people to stick with it and stay in it and know that they'll move through it, right? We all go at different paces in that, but it's a cycle. And that has helped me over time just to acknowledge where I am and then kind of adapt my thinking and my actions to that particular stage to help me get to the next stage.
Yeah, totally makes sense and makes you kind of feel more grounded if you know it's just a normal cycle of
Yep.
life
Yep.
and business, right?
Yeah, exactly. You do. It makes you feel like it's not just me. I'm not so alone. And that is an overall really good message. I know that you try to spread to your audience, right? Is that we're you're we're not alone. We have each other, right? And we have a lot of shared experiences and we can be there to support each other in trying to get through those. So
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate it.
thank you for having me.
And now for my mindful moments for this interview that I had with Janine. So, this interview talked about just the history and generations of entrepreneurs that were in Janine's family, and also how that affects us and the decisions that we make as we go into our future. So, she talked about her grandfather starting this bakery in a small town in California and her father working there as well when he was ready to run the business. Her and her sister worked in this business. However, she knew from a young age that this was not what she wanted to do as she got older. And I think that's a really interesting observation that many times as children, we don't even realize how we start looking into our future based on our current experiences. And even as parents, a lot of times we don't realize the experiences that we're giving our children. They're deciding on their future at the same time. You just think they're doing it. I had this experience when traveling with my children and not realizing that the whole time we were traveling as they were growing up, they were actually looking at it as, well, maybe I would want to live in this place one day or not, until we had a conversation once they got older and they started saying where they wanted to live. And I was like, wow, I had no idea all those years of traveling was going to open their eyes to where they might best fit, where I just assumed they would want to be where they grew up. And so I think it's important to give children that place of exploration to really determine what they want for their life. And I think an important point in here was that her parents were very supportive of her to take another path and to not necessarily become a leader in that bakery as well, generationally, as she could have. And she really went to the going into journalism. She thought about being a teacher. She loved reading. And that's something important for us to realize is what is our joys and how does that contribute to what we do now? And we actually strung that through with her writing as a journalist and how much she had enjoyed writing. And now later on in her career, she's coming back to that joy in how she authors books or writes content and so forth. Wherever we can go back to those innate passions of who we are, that authentic self of ours, it's so important to be able to incorporate that into the things that we do so that we do feel fulfilled by the work. She was sharing a story about writing her book and how it felt heavy when she was writing it in a technical writing way versus when she started writing it in a storyline way and made it more fun and creative for her as she started writing it. So anything can be shifted that what we do. What's important is that we remember what brings us joy and how do we incorporate that joy right within the work that we do. And even if we don't love every task that we're doing, how does it benefit us to be able to do the things that we love to do? We also talked about the way that she structured her life, where she initially started working for a company that was outside of journalism. She didn't actually like the hours of that and started working for a company that she worked for many years because of the life that she could create. This has definitely been a theme throughout this, is that it wasn't just the work that she was going to do. It was also what was the life that she was going to create in any kind of job or career that she decided. Now, it was very much back to her family roots that she did this. We talked about this toward the end, where she talked about learning from her grandfather and her father, all about creating boundaries and making sure that you separated yourself from work when you needed to, so that you could be completely disconnected when you need to. And sometimes we forget that lesson because we are always on now with all the electronics around us. And even when we go on vacation, we say we're on vacation, but we're still answering emails and responding to things. So it's important that we think about if we are truly going to separate from work for a time period, what is the process that you go through to make sure that your work is covered and that you're not paying attention to email and getting stressed so that you can fully get the resolve that you need by taking that time off. As it's summer, it's important that we think about this as we're going away with our families and so forth so that we're present in those experiences and making sure that everybody is aware of where things stand and how things are going to be covered. And lastly, we talked about all the change that's happened in her life as far as her career, her family life, and also as an entrepreneur. And one of the important things that she wanted everyone to take away is that change is really inevitable. There is always a lot of uncertainty, whether you run a business, in your career, in your family life. We cannot control that. But what we can control is how we view it and realize that we spike. We spike high, we go into maintenance mode, we go low. And to realize you're in a cycle and know that if you do the right steps in the right firing order, the right sequence of events, you should be able to get yourself out of it again. So it's important to understand where you stand in that cycle so that you don't get stressed out or have too much anxiety when you're in the process of change. So I want to thank Janine for all of her insights that she offered during this podcast. I also would love for you to subscribe and share this podcast with the people that you care about, that you think that this would help, that may be entrepreneurs, but also maybe people that feel stuck or not taking the time that they need to in their lives to separate work and life and be able to get that reprieve. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a listener of this podcast and being a learner. And that's what this is really about, is we learn from each guest that we have on here about their life's journey and what actions that might be an awareness point for us. We might have heard it before, but today it just struck us a little bit more and is something that we can action from here. And just remember, the energy that you create is contagious. And so being intentional about how you show up each day so that you can find that joy is so important. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to the Breaking Beliefs podcast. I hope you will take a moment to pause before entering back into your day to reflect on this podcast and note 1 to 2 actions you are inspired to do from today's conversation that you could incorporate into your life. To read the full blog and listen back to this episode or any other, you can find them at www.amyvetter.com/Breaking Beliefs podcast and related videos on my YouTube channel. For daily inspiration, follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Amy Vetter CPA. I hope that you will choose to like this and subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and more so that you can join us for more inspiration on our next episode.